Kia ora koutou, and welcome to Wednesday morning's Biosecurity Bonanza. So my name is Dwayne Peltzer. I'm a portfolio leader for the Managing Invasive Species Group at Manaki Whenua at the BSI, and just want to thank everyone for joining this morning. So today we're going to hear from Elise Arnst all about wilding conifers, reinvasion, and the, plant community responses. Elise is really a plant ecologist. She's been really involved with things like rare ecosystems, plant community composition, and our national vegetation survey. So really good to hear from Elise today. She's actually gone back and is doing a PhD studies at AUT. So we'll hear a little bit of some of her work, and also Jen Bufford's work on the Vive la Resistance MB program on wildings. So just before we hand things over to Elise and let her tell us all about her work with wilding pines, I just want to say that these webinars are really a good chance to ask questions, to engage, and the Q&A function off to the side is the best place to do that. If it's in the chat, we'll still get it, but better in the Q&A. At the end of the webinar, we'll have a chance to go through those and answer them. If we don't get to your question today, there certainly is a chance to, you'll get a written response following today's session. The entire webinar and the Q&A will be recorded, and so you can look at it afterwards, or if people couldn't make the session this morning, we can share that afterwards. Thanks so much for attending, and I'll pass it over to Elise now. Cheers, Elise.
Kia ora. Thanks, Dwayne. So today my presentation is wilding conifers reinvade despite control efforts while native plants fail to thrive. And as Dwayne mentioned, this is a combination of work led by Jennifer Bufford and myself. So firstly, just starting with a little bit of background on wilding pines. Of the vascular plants considered to have significant adverse ecological effects in Aotearoa, 5% are introduced conifer species. They are non-native trees from the Pinaceae family, which are commonly referred to as either wilding conifers or wilding pines in New Zealand. Globally, they've been widely introduced and have become invasive in a number of countries, particularly in the Southern Hemisphere. The benefits of planted exotic conifers are well known, including economic value, scenic and recreational value, firewood shelter, and carbon sequestration. However, they are highly invasive and impact a range of ecosystems from tussock grasslands to shrublands and forests, and are both an economic and an environmental threat. Some of the most common species that are invasive in New Zealand are Pinus contorta, Pseudopseudos menziesii, Douglas fir, Pinus radiata, Pinus ponderosa, and Pinus nigra. So pines invade a range of ecosystems from coastal to subalpine, and invasion of tree species into non-forested areas is particularly problematic. Some of the ecological impacts that they have include conversion of grassland and shrubland to forest. They displace native species, causing habitat loss for native plants, birds, and invertebrates, and changes to soil microbes. Pines often co-invade with a non-native ectomycorrhizal fungi, which is useful for the invading pine species and may make it easier for trees to reinvade into controlled areas. They also alter soil nutrient levels and nutrient cycling and fire regimes. Some of the economic impacts include using more water than native species, which can cause a reduction in surface water flow, impacting on water levels in rivers and dams used for hydroelectricity generation, and that also may increase the need for irrigation on productive land. Pines change the fuel load, so usually increase the fuel load available, which changes fire regimes, resulting in more frequent fires. And invasion also often results in a loss of productive land available for agriculture and limits the potential future uses of the land. So this lovely diagram you can see here is from a paper by Martin Nunes, and I'd highly encourage you to have a look at that after this talk, specifically looking at tree invasive trees and grasslands and use the impact of mitigating climate change effects. So while we know pines have lots of negative impacts ecologically and economically, and we have a number of studies documenting these impacts, there's actually relatively little knowledge of how long these changes persist after the trees have been controlled. So for the work I'm talking about today, we mostly focused on lodgepole pine, or Pinus contorta. It's one of the most invasive and widespread pine species in New Zealand. It was introduced in the 1880s for commercial forestry and later for erosion control, and was widely planted. Concern about the spread of Pinus contorta led to its removal as early as the 1950s. However, commercial planting didn't cease until the 1980s. Pinus contorta cones early compared to other pine species and regularly produces lightweight, wind-dispersed seeds which can travel quite large distances, meaning that it spreads readily. So substantial funding from both government and private sources has gone into controlling pines across New Zealand. Government funding has come from a number of different sources, including the National Wilding Conifer Program, which was $100 million over 4 years, COVID funding, Jobs for Nature, and more recently, the International Visitor Levy. The current baseline funding is only $10 million a year, and this has been allocated through till 2030. Many landowners also fund control, and a lot of volunteer time goes into helping control efforts, mostly on public land. So far, over 2 million hectares has had some control, which is approximately 70% of the current extent of wilding pines, and a substantial proportion of this is Pinus contorta. The current rationale for funding is investment in rural productivity and long-term rural resilience, but because control is being undertaken on both productive and conservation land, the idea is that native ecosystems will also benefit. There has been relatively little research on the long-term outcomes for biodiversity and for ecosystem restoration, which are both implied benefits of undertaking control. So to address this gap, we carried out 2 separate studies. The first was a national scale study, which is led by Jennifer Buffett, and she was mostly wanting to quantify the levels of reinvasion at a national scale and discover what patterns there were with reinvasion. And so reinvasion is when an area is being controlled and then hopefully most of the plants have died, but then you'll get new trees germinating and growing in areas that have already been controlled. And then I led a local study based in the Mackenzie Basin, which was more specifically focused on the plant community responses after wilding pine control and looking at some of the ecological drivers that were determining the outcomes for plant communities. So a small disclaimer, both of these studies, the manuscripts are in preparation, so this is a bit of an early sneak peek at some results. So first, looking at Jennifer's national scale study, she wanted to ask, are reinvasions occurring, meaning that pines are coming back stronger following control? Most of the information we had were anecdotes, so her goal was to have some data to support these anecdotes, which are that reinvasion is driven by trees that survive control and also by neighbouring uncontrolled pine populations. That reinvasion is accelerated by legacy, so that's the changes to the soil that occur when the first wave of invasion occurred remain following control and then make it easier for individuals to reinvade. And that there are cumulative effects on native species from multiple waves of invasion. Also, that reinvasion is widespread. It's not a small problem. So what does drive reinvasion at the landscape scale? She wanted to ask, what is the speed and magnitude of reinvasion? And does reinvasion decline with harsh climate and soils? And what happens to plant communities? So to answer these questions, we conducted surveys across New Zealand in five broad regions: Marlborough, Molesworth, Craigieburn, Pukaki and Mid-Dome, and some in the Kawikas. The sites were a range of environmental gradients, including elevation, rainfall and soil types. And the map you can see shows the sites where she split original pine invasions were high density, which is the triangles, or low density, which is the circles. So at each of 105 plots across these regions, we measured the plant community in a 10 by 10 metre plot. And this was just a broad summary categorising the vegetation by percent cover into categories by biostatus, so exotic and native, and by growth form. So in terms of pines across these sites, Pinus contorta was the most dominant species, followed by Douglas fir, which was widespread and is of increasing concern to many land managers. The other pine species seen were more regionally specific, with larch in the Arrowtown area, Pinus sylvestris in Molesworth, and also Pinus radiata, and in the Pukaki area also a bit of Pinus ponderosa. So how many pines survive control? Here we've got results split into the pre-control density of pines, so whether pines were high density prior to control or low density, and we can see that at the high density sites, more conifers, more individuals have survived the control. And this is often because the density means with an aerial chemical spray, some of the bigger trees will shelter some of the smaller trees, and so they don't get sprayed. So the next question is, how quickly do pines reinvade? So here you can see on the left-hand axis the reinvading pines per hectare, and then across the bottom the number of years since control. The points are coloured by life stage, so you can see that there are lots of seedlings germinating at quite high rates, but they often don't persist. So if we remove the seedlings from this plot so that you can see the saplings and adult trees more easily, it's clear that the surviving trees, sorry, I've lost my train of thought on that one. We get adults coming through reinvading fairly quickly. So looking at what factors influence how quickly pines reinvade, the two most important factors were the number of surviving trees after control, and also the time since control. Interestingly, that soil chemistry and other environmental factors were not as significant for how quickly pines reinvade. So how quickly do pines start coning? Surviving trees take a couple of years post-control to start coning, but they do pretty quickly. So that's the darker green dots on this plot. The reinvading trees, which are the ones that have germinated post-control, take a bit longer, but Pinus contorta is known to cone from about 7 years on, and you can see that in this plot, the lighter green dots, coning starts about 7 years and then increases from there. So from this, we can conclude that the number of survivors is linked to the speed of reinvasion, and that effective control is important to limit coning. So where do we find native dominated communities? So again, this is at the national scale. We see that pre-controlled pine cover, so the density from low on the left-hand side across to high pine density on the right-hand side, is directly correlated with the proportion of native cover. And this gives us a general pattern, but it's not enough information to determine the actual drivers of the change in native cover. And you'll see here that some low pine density sites also have low native cover, and this is generally linked to annual precipitation, so these are quite dry sites, and we'll explore this further in the next study. So overall, we've seen that reinvasions are reasonably widespread, and quite a few contorta survive control. Those survivors start coning quite quickly, and reinvasion happens within 5 years and can reach huge numbers after a decade. Climate and soils explain some of the changes to native cover, but they don't explain the reinvasion. Historically, dense pine sites don't have many native species post-control and instead have many exotic grasses and shrubs. So to dig into some of the impacts on and drivers of what's happening in the native communities, I carried out a local scale study looking at how plant communities respond following the control of Pinus contorta. And I had two main questions. Does pine removal aid native species recovery, or are pines facilitating secondary invasion by other species of exotics like grasses and shrubs? And slightly different to the national scale study here, we split historic pine density into 3 categories: low, which is just scattered, a medium density, and high density, which is a closed canopy. So this study was in the Mackenzie Basin, and again, as opposed to the national scale study, we specifically limited the environment to very similar elevation, rainfall, and soil types, so that we could really dig into what the pines were doing rather than what was natural variation in the environment. So we measured 54 plots and recorded vegetation in 10 by 10 metre squares, and in this case we did measure to species level. And we also collected soil samples looking at soil chemistry to see if the changes that we know pines make to the soil persist following control, and also some other environmental variables, which I'll dig into further. So looking at the post-pine vegetation, here, this is the species that we found occurring in our plots. The exotic species are in orange and the native species are in turquoise. You can see in red the Pinus contorta is reinvading as well. So points are proportional to how frequently each species occurred, and you can see that the most frequent species were exotics, particularly Agrostis capillaris and Anthos anthem, which occurred in 53 of the 54 plots. And the small dots show that a lot of species actually only occurred once. So if we dig into that a bit further and split between native and exotic species, looking at both cover and species richness. On the left, if we start with cover, we see that exotic species have no significant change in cover with changing historic pine density. Although at the high density, there is quite a lot of variation, and this is related to the time since control. So sites that were controlled more recently still have standing dead pines and they provide shelter, whereas dense sites that were controlled a long time ago, those trees have fallen over. If we look at native cover with change in historic pine density, there's a significant decrease between low and medium historic pine density where native cover decreases. Then if we look at the right-hand plot, looking at species richness, again, we see that the exotic species richness doesn't change particularly much with different densities of pine. However, the native species richness does decline quite rapidly with increasing historic pine density. So we're losing both species, native species cover, and the number of species is decreasing. And the plant communities are also becoming simpler. So here again, we've got the same 3 categories of historic pine density, and then the stacked bars are looking at growth forms. So in the low cover sites, we have things like Muhlenbeckia and other native vines and shrubs. And they drop off as the pine density increases. Interestingly, the exotic forb in the orange colour is mostly Hyraceum, which likes light, and then as the pine density increases, that also decreases. But by the time we get to the high density sites, we have a lot of exotic grasses left, and that overwhelms all the other types. So what are the key drivers? Here you can see the different plots categorized by the historic pine density, and the green, the arrows show a significant relationship with a measured environmental variable, and the length of the line shows the strength of the relationship. So here we see that we have much higher native species richness in the low sites, which are the green dots, and that's correlated with decreasing soil moisture, which is interesting. Soil moisture being higher in the areas where there are still standing dead pines. The most interesting is the pH has quite a short line, so we know that pines change soil pH, but actually this effect is relatively short-lived in the soil, and the more significant soil change is soil phosphorus becomes a lot more available under pines, and that persists following control. And many exotic grass species thrive in high soil phosphorus, and so that relationship is quite closely aligned. So overall, we see that following pine control, natives still fail to thrive. The pine invasion impacts native diversity and abundance even decades after control, and the soil changes caused by pine invasion persist. Overall, we see that plant communities are becoming more similar. So overall conclusions from both of these studies show that reinvasion is widespread following control. It happens very quickly and has the potential to accelerate ongoing invasions. Survivors comb quickly and are a key seed source. We also know from other research done by our BSI colleagues at Scion that dead trees can also provide a seed source immediately following control. So this shows that we need to do follow-up control. It's not just a one and done. The long-term impact on natives continues after pines have been removed, and those pine legacies, particularly in the soil, persist potentially for decades. The dense sites post-control are now mostly exotic grasses with very few native species. So this really shows that controlling early in a pine invasion is the best way to reduce the impact on native plant communities. So just finally, a list of acknowledgements. Jen's work was funded through an MB Endeavour grant, Viva la Resistance, which was led by Thomas Paul at Scion. Both Jen and I had some great help from field crews, a number of people, both Manaaki Whenua and a number of volunteers, which was great. Tom Cullen and Matt Scott at Scion were also involved in with my work, Hannah Buckley and Brad Case at AUT. Doc staff were really helpful, especially in site selection, and so we'd like to thank them and a host of landowners who were also instrumental in getting this work underway. Thank you.
Oh, kia ora, Elise. Thanks so much. Hey, we've got just a couple of minutes for questions, and so if you do have some, put them in the Q&A, and we'll try to answer them now or in the follow-up. So, Elise, there's one here. Thanks, Elise. Super interesting presentation. I'll agree with that. Thank you. So the question is, wondering what the timber industry's perspective is on wilding pine control.
That's an interesting question. I guess it depends if you're asking about should they be doing control or the type of control. Obviously, things like biocontrol are probably slightly more controversial with the timber industry because they would like to protect a productive crop. In terms of who pays for wilding control, is it public good, or do we need to try and identify the seed source of where the wildings have come from, which becomes tricky, especially as you see with reinvasions. It's not necessarily one source. So I think, yeah, there's multiple answers to that question.
Yeah. Sorry, I should have followed up a bit too. There's a second piece to it, which is, so for your own findings, I guess your work showing early controls effective. So do you think that would be receptive? Do you think you could, I guess, how would you bundle this up as advice to forest owners of various types?
Sure. So I think there's two parts to control. So obviously controlling the coning trees is really important to stop spread. But controlling the smaller seedlings and saplings early in an invasion is important for limiting their impact. So it's not an either or, we need to control invasions at all stages.
Cool. Hey, we've got a different one here about the soil changes, Elise. So the question is, would the soil changes prevent transplanted natives or assume restoration from thriving or not? Any ideas on that?
Potentially, yeah. So the soil available phosphorus was the big one because once it's available, it's there. And natives really don't seem to like that higher phosphorus level. So it would be looking at how we can either reduce that phosphorus level or make it somehow a nicer environment for the native species, which would come into planning for restoration efforts.
Awesome. That covers off. There's a couple of questions around that soil phosphorus and persistence. So that's a bit of a, I guess, have you got any additional thoughts? Like what could you do about that increase in soil phosphorus if you wanted to lower it or maybe do some restoration? Any ideas on that?
I think it's hard, especially because often we're looking at a landscape scale. So we could potentially take some action at a small scale if you're doing a small restoration project, but at a landscape scale it's very difficult to change the availability of soil phosphorus.
Well, I think we're up to our 10:30. So any final thoughts or parting thoughts, Elise?
I guess control is important. Don't give up, and we've really seen how important it is to do the follow-up control efforts rather than doing one control effort and crossing our fingers. So it's really that partnership between government, landowners and volunteer groups has been really important to trying to get this invasion under control.
Awesome. Hey, thank you so much, Elise, Adrian, for running the background. I'll just close us off. Any questions that we haven't answered, apologies, but we will follow up. Also wanted to flag that there is, of course, the Wildings Conference next week, and there may be some media. So some of what Elise has talked about, you'll see in the media and may hear more next week, as there's a lot of focus on Wildings at the conference in Twizel. So thank you very much, ka kite, and thanks also to the team for hosting the Bonanza.